In the fall of 1876, in a small saloon near the stockyards of Dodge City, Kansas, Elias Sutter set his glass down on the wooden bar and studied his nephew for a long moment before he spoke. "Can't decide if I should call you a fool or just plain reckless." Micah Sutter didn't answer right away. He turned the glass slowly in his hand, looking out through the window at the pens beyond. Longhorns packed shoulder to shoulder, dust hanging thick in the air, men shouting over the bawling of cattle. The smell of manure, horse sweat, and tobacco smoke had worked itself into everything in that room, into every breath a man took.
"I've thought it through, Uncle Elias."
"Thought it through?" The older man's laugh had no humor in it. "You're fixing to walk away from a business that's making men rich, to go break ground on land nobody wants, because nobody thinks it'll grow a thing." Micah didn't argue the point. He knew his uncle wasn't wrong. 3 years working alongside him had shown Micah exactly how much money moved through Dodge City on the backs of cattle. Hundreds of thousands of head a season, money flowing through like the river itself. But he'd seen something else too, something nobody else in this town seemed to notice. Not 1 acre around here was being turned for a crop. Nobody was growing hay to sell back to the very cattle that filled these pens. Nobody was growing so much as a row of vegetables for the eating houses springing up along Front Street. "Ground out there's dry, and you know it," Elias said, his voice dropping, closer to pleading now than warning. "Summer'll bake it hard as brick. Winter wind'll cut a man in half. Hendricks tried wheat out that way 4 years back. You know how that ended." "I know." "And you're still fixin' to take Cora and the boy out there?" Micah stood, laid a few coins on the bar. "I'm taking my whole family out there." His uncle said nothing more. He only watched his nephew's back as Micah walked out, crossed the dust-choked street toward the wagon waiting at the end of it, Cora sitting up front with their son in her lap, and behind them, everything the family owned. No one in that town knew it that day, but 12 years later, the ground nobody wanted to farm would be the one thing still standing when the worst storm the plains had ever seen swept through and took nearly everything else with it. The land Micah bought sat 11 miles southwest of town, where the buffalo grass gave way to harder soil and the wind never seemed to rest. 60 acres, a 2-room soddy already standing on it, and a well that hadn't been dug deep enough. The previous owner had given up after 2 summers and gone back east. Cora walked the property before Micah did. She knelt in 3 different spots, pushed her fingers into the dirt, rubbed it between her palms, and said nothing for a long while. "Well?" Micah asked. "It's not the worst I've seen." She stood, wiped her hands on her skirt. "My father worked ground harder than this in Missouri before he learned what it wanted." That was the whole conversation. No promises made, no reassurances given. Micah had learned that much about his wife already. She didn't speak to comfort a man, only to tell him what she believed was true. They moved their few belongings into the soddy before the first frost. Eli was not yet a year old, and Cora carried him on her hip while she worked the small kitchen garden plot, the one thing she insisted on planting before anything else went into the ground. Word traveled fast in a county this thin on people. By the second week, a neighbor named Orville Dietz rode over under the pretense of welcoming them, though his eyes spent more time on the empty fields than on Micah's face. "Heard you worked cattle in Dodge," Orville said. 3 years? Good money in that." It was. Orville looked out at the flat, dry stretch of land running toward the horizon. "Man could run stock out here easy enough. Grass'll hold a small herd, maybe." "I'm not running stock. Not yet, anyway." "Then what?" "Wheat first, some corn. See what the ground wants after that." Orville didn't laugh. Not outright, but something in his face shifted, the way a man's face does when he's decided he's heard enough foolishness for one visit. He tipped his hat and rode off without another word, and Micah understood that whatever Orville said to the next man he met would not be kind. He was right. By spring, the story had made its way through every soddy and dugout for 10 miles. The cattleman gone soft. The fool who'd left good money in Dodge to scratch at dirt nobody wanted. Micah heard it secondhand from the man who sold him seed, heard it again from the blacksmith in town, and never once heard it from anyone brave enough to say it to his face. He didn't argue with any of it. There wasn't much to argue. He'd been in this country 3 years, buying and grading cattle, and he knew exactly nothing about turning soil. What he did know, the only thing he carried out of Dodge City that was worth anything now, was an eye for hay. He'd spent 3 years standing in feedlots, pulling handfuls from wagons before a rancher's man could talk him into a bad price. He knew the smell of hay that had taken rain before it dried. He knew the color that meant it was cut too late, the brittleness that meant it was cut too early, the faint sour edge under the grass smell that meant mold was already working somewhere inside a bale. Ranchers paid him to know these things. It was the one skill he owned outright. It would be another 2 years before that skill meant anything to him at all. That first spring, Micah broke ground the way he'd seen it done. Plow deep, turn the sod, plant, wait. Nobody had told him the ground here held water differently than the land back east, that a hard rain could run off before it ever soaked in, that the wind alone could pull the moisture out of turned soil inside a week if a man wasn't careful. He found this out the way most men found things out on this stretch of prairie, by watching it fail in front of him. The wheat came up thin and yellow. What survived the dry stretch in June didn't survive the hailstorm in July. By August, Micah stood at the edge of a field that had cost him a winter's worth of savings and had given back almost nothing. Cora stood beside him, saying nothing for a long moment. "I don't know this ground," Micah said finally. "I know cattle. I know hay when I see it. I don't know dirt." "I know some of it," Cora said. "Not all. My father didn't grow wheat out here. He grew it in Missouri, on land that gets rain when it's supposed to." She looked out at the ruined field. "But dirt's dirt, mostly. It just needs different patience." Micah looked at the far corner of the field, a patch that had done even worse than the rest, ground so hard and pale it had barely taken the plow. "That corner's not worth touching again," he said. "Waste of seed." Cora walked to it, crouched down, took a handful, let it run through her fingers. "Let me try it." He didn't ask what she meant to do. He didn't have anything better to offer. "Go ahead." Cora spent the rest of that August working the corner Micah had given up on. She didn't explain what she was doing, and he didn't ask. He had enough of his own mistakes to sort through. What she did, he pieced together only by watching. She hauled manure from the small pen where they kept 2 milk cows and a mule, spread it thin across the corner plot, and let it sit through the fall instead of planting anything at all. When Micah asked why she'd leave good ground empty through a season, she said only, "It's not empty, it's working." He didn't understand what she meant by that, not yet. The second spring went no better than the first. Micah tried corn this time, on the advice of a seed merchant in town who swore it handled dry spells better than wheat. The corn came up fine through May, then a hot wind blew through in June and burned the leaves brown inside 3 days. Micah stood at the edge of that field, the same way he'd stood at the edge of the wheat the year before, and for the first time since leaving Dodge City, he let himself wonder if Orville Dietz and every other man laughing behind his back might simply be right. That was the year the drifter came through. His name was Amos Teller, an old man riding a mule too thin for the miles he claimed to have covered. He stopped at the well to water the animal and stayed only long enough to drink a cup of coffee Cora offered him. He'd farmed 20 years in eastern Kansas, he said, before his knees gave out, and he took to wandering instead. He looked at the burned corn without much interest, then walked over to the corner plot Cora had worked the fall before, the one she'd since planted with clover instead of a cash crop. "Smart," he said, nodding at it. "Most folks out here don't know clover'll do that. Puts back what the ground's missing. My daddy always said, you can't keep taking from land and never giving nothing back. Ground's not so different from a man that way." He said it plainly, the way a man remarks on weather, then finished his coffee and rode on. He never gave his direction, never asked for work, never came back. Cora remembered his name. Micah barely did. But something in what the old man said stuck with him longer than he expected. Not the words exactly, but the plain fact that a stranger passing through knew more about this dirt in 5 minutes than Micah had learned in 2 years of breaking his back over it. That winter, Cora laid it out for him plain, the way she laid out most things. Corn's not going to work here, not without more water than we've got. Wheat might, if we plant it different, earlier, so it beats the worst of the heat. But the ground needs building up first. It's been farmed rough and given nothing back. That corner did fine because I fed it a season before I asked it for anything. So we lose another year. We don't lose it, we spend it. Micah didn't answer that right away. He was still a man who believed a season either paid or it didn't. And the notion of spending a year on ground and calling it anything but a loss sat uneasy with him. But he had nothing better to offer, and the corner plot stood green through the fall while the rest of the field lay bare and cracked. And a man could only argue with a green field for so long. They worked it together that 3rd year, not evenly, not as equals in every task, but each carrying what they knew. Cora decided what went into the ground and when, how long a plot rested before it was asked to produce, which sections took manure and which took nothing but time. Micah broke the sod, hauled water from the well in dry stretches, and spent long evenings walking the fence line with nothing to do but think. Because for the first time since he'd left Dodge City, thinking was the only useful thing left to do. It was during one of those evenings that the shape of something else occurred to him, something that had been sitting in plain sight since the day he'd arrived. Every rancher within 30 miles of Dodge City bought hay. Every one of them. The open range fed cattle well enough in summer, but a hard winter turned grass into something a man couldn't count on. And the ranchers who'd learned that lesson the hard way paid good money for hay they didn't have to gamble on. Nobody around here was growing it to sell. He mentioned it to Cora one evening while she worked a needle through a torn shirt by lamplight. "You know hay?" she said without looking up. "Better than most men who've never touched a plow in their life." "I know good hay from bad. Doesn't mean I know how to grow it." "No," she agreed, "but I know how to grow it. You know who'll pay for it, and what they'll pay, and whether it's worth selling before you cut it or after you've dried it proper." She bit the thread and knotted it. "Seems like that's most of the business right there." Micah sat with that a long moment. He'd spent 3 years in Dodge City, believing the only thing he had to offer this family was what he'd left behind: cattle money. A trade he understood, a life he'd walked away from for reasons he still had trouble putting into plain words. It hadn't occurred to him until just then that the thing he'd walked away with wasn't nothing. It was an eye for hay, a nose for what made it good, an understanding of exactly what a rancher needed and feared running short of come January. "Grass," he said slowly. "Not wheat, not corn. Grass for hay." "Most of it," Cora said, "not all of it. Man's got to eat something besides money." That was the last hard winter they spent guessing at what the ground wanted. Everything that came after built on what they'd learned in those first 3 years, one failed field and one small green corner at a time. By the 4th year, the Sutter place had stopped looking like a failure and started looking like something else entirely, though it took the county longer to notice than it took Micah and Cora to feel it. Most of the 60 acres went into grass, timothy and native prairie hay, sown thick in the fields Cora had spent 2 seasons building up with manure and rest. A smaller stretch, maybe 10 acres, went into wheat, planted early, the way Cora had learned it should be done out here, in the ground before the worst of the heat came, so it ripened and came off before July could burn it down to nothing. A garden behind the soddy fed the family and left enough extra to trade in town for what they couldn't grow themselves. Micah cut hay the way a man cuts something he understands. He walked the fields before harvest, pulled stalks between his fingers, checked the color against what the sun had done to it, judged whether another day of curing would help or hurt. When it came time to sell, he did what he'd done for 3 years in Dodge City. He stood in front of a buyer, pulled a handful from the load, brought it to his nose, and broke a stem clean in half to look at what was inside. Buyers noticed. A rancher named Sedgwick, who ran nearly 400 head north of town, stopped Micah outside the feed store one afternoon. "You still do that," Sedgwick said. "That thing with the hay, smelling it, breaking it." "Habit," Micah said. "Good habit. I bought bad hay off 3 different men last winter, lost stock over it. Never once bought bad hay off you." That was the whole of the conversation, but it did more for the Sutter place than any advertisement could have. Word moved slow out here, but it moved true. And a rancher who trusted a man's hay told another rancher, and by the 5th year, Micah wasn't looking for buyers anymore. Buyers came looking for him, because nobody else within 30 miles was growing hay to sell, and the ones who were didn't know a good bale from a bad one the way Micah did. Cora's part of the work showed itself slower, in ways a man riding past on the road wouldn't have noticed. She kept the fields moving, grass in one section, clover turned under in another, a plot resting a season before it took a crop again. She never explained the reasoning in more words than the work required. When Micah asked why one field got manure and another didn't, she told him plainly, "That one's tired. This one isn't." It worked well enough that by the 6th year, the ground that had burned 2 crops in 2 seasons was carrying hay thick enough to cut twice. Eli grew up in the middle of all of it, too young in the early years to understand why his father had walked away from a business that made men rich, old enough by 6 or 7 to trail behind Micah through the fields, asking why they didn't just raise cattle like everyone else did. Micah never had a clean answer for that. Mostly, he told the boy to go help his mother, or to carry water, or to keep the birds off the garden. The kind of answer a man gives when he hasn't fully worked out the reason himself, only the results. By the time Eli was old enough to be useful, he was gathering loose hay into the wagon during cutting season and learning, without anyone teaching him directly, to watch his father's hands the way his father watched the grass. The same handful pulled and smelled and broken, over and over, season after season, until the boy could do a rough version of it himself without knowing exactly what he was checking for. The haystacks were Cora's doing as much as Micah's, worked out together over a couple of bad winters where careless stacking had cost them 1/5 of what they'd cut. A stack thrown up loose and square held water like a sponge. The outer hay rotted through by February, and the loss ate straight into what they'd have to sell. They learned to build them differently, round-topped instead of flat, so rain shed off the sides instead of pooling, raised off the bare ground on a base of brush and old fence poles, so damp couldn't creep up from underneath, packed tight enough at the crown that a man could run his hand along the top after a hard rain and find it dry an inch down. It wasn't a secret method. Any farmer who'd worked hay long enough in wet country could have told them the same thing, but nobody around Dodge City had needed to know it before, because nobody around Dodge City had been in the business of storing hay through a winter to sell it slow, a wagon load at a time, at whatever price a rancher was willing to pay when his own grass ran short. Elias Sutter rode out from Dodge City twice a year, more out of habit than obligation at first. He never said he'd been wrong. He didn't need to. What he did instead, quietly, without making a show of it, was mention Micah's name to ranchers he dealt with in town. Men looking for hay who didn't know where to find it. Men Elias had done cattle business with for years and trusted enough to steer toward his nephew. "Heard you're still out there scratching in the dirt," he said once, the closest he ever came to acknowledging any of it out loud. "Still scratching," Micah said. "Sedgwick's asking after more hay than you sold him last time. Told him you'd have it." "I might." Elias nodded, drank the rest of his coffee, and didn't say anything else about it. That was how it went between them from then on. Not an apology, not a change of heart spoken plainly, just an old man sending business a young man's way and calling it nothing at all. By 1883, 7 years after the wagon ride out from Dodge City, the Sutter place was the only farm for 30 miles selling hay by the wagon load instead of feeding it straight to its own stock. Prices held steady because there was no one to undercut them. Ranchers paid what Micah asked because what Micah sold didn't spoil, didn't mold, didn't cost them stock the way a bad winter's feed could. Nobody in the county called him a fool anymore. Nobody said much of anything, which was its own kind of answer. But none of it had been tested yet. Not really. 7 easy winters and a handful of hard ones had come and gone, but nothing had come close to breaking what they'd built. That was still ahead of them. By the fall of 1885, the Sutter place had 80 acres in grass and hay, another 15 in wheat and garden crops, and a herd small enough to count on 2 hands. 6 milk cows, a handful of hogs, enough stock to keep manure coming for the fields and food on the table, and no more than that. Micah had turned down offers to run cattle in a larger way more than once. A man couldn't water a big herd and irrigate a hay crop both, not on this ground, not with the well they had. He'd learned that lesson early enough not to need learning twice. That fall, Micah put up more hay than any year before it. Not because he knew what was coming, no man did, but because caution had become a habit by then, the same way pulling a handful of grass to his nose had become a habit. Prices had been climbing steady for 2 years as more ranchers pushed cattle onto open range that hadn't seen a hard winter in a while. Sedgwick had said as much himself, standing in the Sutter yard that October, looking over the stacks. "Feels like a big winter coming," he said. "Can't say why. Just a feeling." "Feelings don't cost me anything to plan around," Micah said. "I'll cut what I can before frost." He and Eli, 17 that year and near as tall as his father, spent the better part of a month building stacks taller than either of them had built before. Round-topped, raised on brush, packed tight at the crown the way Cora had taught them both, though by now Eli did it without needing to be told which way the water should run. On the last day of December, the sky over the plains turned a color neither Micah nor Cora had words for. A dull, purple-yellow, low on the horizon that Cora noticed first, standing at the well before sunrise. "Micah." He came out, looked where she was looking, and didn't say anything for a moment. "Get the stock in the barn," he said. "All of it. Water troughs filled. Eli, help your mother close every shutter tight." The wind came before noon, and it didn't slow after that. Snow drove sideways across the yard, thick enough to erase the fence line inside an hour. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped further than any of them had felt it drop before, and it kept dropping through the night and into the next day, and the day after that. They didn't know, not for days, what the storm was doing beyond their own fence posts. They only knew what it was doing to them. Testing the barn roof, testing the door latches, testing the stacks standing out past the yard, round-topped and packed tight, exactly as they'd been built to be tested. The stacks held. Snow piled against the sides and crusted over, but the crown stayed sealed the way it always had. And when Micah dug into one on the 4th day to pull feed for the stock, the hay inside was dry as the day they'd cut it. It was near 2 weeks before the roads opened enough for word to travel. When it did, it came slow and grim. Ranchers who'd trusted open range to feed their herds through a mild winter had lost cattle by the hundreds. Animals caught in the open with nothing between them and the wind, no stored feed to fall back on when the grass went under 3 feet of snow and ice. Sedgwick lost near a third of his herd. Orville Dietz, who'd laughed at Micah 9 years back for turning ground nobody wanted, lost stock too, though he never said how much, and nobody asked him to his face. The hay Micah had put up that fall sold before February was out. Every wagon load he could spare went for a price he hadn't had to argue for, to ranchers who needed feed for whatever stock they had left and needed it fast. He didn't feel triumphant selling it. He felt like a man handing over the one thing standing between somebody's remaining herd and starvation. And he charged a fair price and not a cent more, because that was the only way it sat right with him. "You did well this winter," Elias said, riding out in March once the worst of the mud had firmed enough to travel. He looked older than Micah remembered, worn down by a season that had cost half his cattle clients their herds. Every rancher I deal with is asking after you now. I didn't do anything different this year than I've done the last 5, Micah said. Just did more of it. That's the whole trick, isn't it? Elias looked out at the stacks, half emptied now, the snow around them trampled to mud. Most men wait till the storm's already here to figure out what they should have done. Micah didn't answer that. He was watching Eli across the yard, forking hay down from what was left of the tallest stack, moving through the work the same steady way he'd moved through it every season since he was old enough to lift a fork. Not because anyone had told him exactly how, but because he'd watched it enough times to know. The storm hadn't made the Sutter place what it was. It had only shown, plain as anything, what 9 years of building it right had already made true. The change didn't happen that spring, and it didn't happen the spring after that either. Micah had learned enough by then not to trust a single hard season to tell him what the next 10 years would look like. The winter of '86 had broken the open-range gamble for a lot of ranchers. But breaking a way of doing things and replacing it with another took longer than one bad storm, no matter how bad it had been. Through '86 and into '87, most of the county still ran cattle the way it always had, just fewer of them, and more carefully. What Micah noticed, slow at first, was the shift in what men asked him for. Ranchers who'd once bought hay only when a hard winter forced their hand started asking about it in September instead of December, wanting to know what he'd have and whether they could count on it every year, not just the bad ones. A few asked whether he'd sell seed corn or knew a man who would. The eating houses in town wanted more from the garden than Cora had ever grown to sell, more than she could grow alone some seasons. They're not asking because of one winter, Cora said, the second year after the storm, watching Micah frown over a stack of orders he couldn't fill from what they had planted. They're asking because the winter showed them what happens when nobody around here grows anything but cattle. Takes them long enough to notice. Takes most people that long to notice anything. By 1888, 12 years after the wagon ride out of Dodge City, the Sutter place had changed shape again, slower and more deliberate than the change that had followed the storm itself. They'd pulled back some of the hay ground, not all of it. Ranchers still needed feed, and always would, and put more of it into wheat and garden crops. Enough that Cora hired 2 women from town during harvest to help with what she could no longer manage on her own. The herd stayed small, same as always, 6 or 7 head at a time, just enough to keep the fields fed with what the fields needed most. Elias came out that fall with a man Micah had never met, a buyer from a grain concern working the rail line east of Dodge, looking to contract wheat 2 seasons ahead instead of buying it loose at harvest. Told him you give him a fair count and stand behind it, Elias said, by way of introduction. That's worth more to men like him than a low price. Micah shook the buyer's hand and didn't ask his uncle why he'd bothered making the trip out just to say 4 sentences and stand in the yard a while. He didn't need to ask. It had been 12 years since a man in a saloon in Dodge City had called him a fool and reckless in the same breath, and neither of them had ever spoken of that night again. They didn't need to. The wagon loads leaving the Sutter place twice a season said everything that needed saying. One afternoon that same fall, Mike and Cora rode the wagon out past their own fence line to look at a parcel of land coming up for sale to the west. Flatter than their own ground, paler in color, the kind of dirt most men in the county still wouldn't waste a season on. Micah stood at the edge of it a long while, saying nothing, the way he'd stood at the edge of a burned cornfield 12 years before. Then he turned to Cora. "What do you think?" She looked out at the flat, pale stretch of ground, then back at him, and something in her face eased into something close to a smile. "Worth a try." Neither of them said anything more. They climbed back onto the wagon and rode home in the fading light, past their own fields, the haystack standing round-topped against the sky, the wheat stubble gold in the low sun, Eli's figure small in the distance walking the fence line the way his father still did most evenings, out of habit more than need. That evening after supper, Micah and Cora sat on the porch the way they did most nights once the chores were finished, the prairie stretching flat and quiet in front of them until it met the darkening sky. Eli's voice carried faintly from the barn, talking low to the horses as he finished the last of the evening feed. Neither of them spoke for a long while. There wasn't much left that needed saying that the land in front of them hadn't already said on its own. 12 years of it, laid out in fields that had once been nothing but dry ground and a soddy with a well dug too shallow. Cora finally broke the quiet, not with words, but by leaning her shoulder against his. Micah didn't say anything back. He just looked out at what they'd built and let it stand as the only answer either of them needed.